The fog had rolled in like a living thing, thick, heavy, swallowing the bridge one steel beam at a time. Drivers always joked that the old Ravensford Bridge looked like it disappeared into another world when the weather turned, but on this particular morning, the joke felt more like a warning nobody understood until it was too late. At 5:42 a.m., when most of the city was still asleep, the survivors remembered the way the air tasted metallic, cold, and strangely still, as if everything was holding its breath. The first survivor, a delivery driver named Marcus Hale, said he had turned off his radio because something about the silence outside demanded his attention. No wind. No distant engines. Just fog pressing against the glass, thick enough that even the bridge's railings vanished into it. He slowed his truck almost instinctively, squinting ahead, trying to make out the road. And then, he saw movement. A faint silhouette kneeling near the left suspension cables. At first, he assumed it was a maintenance worker, but there was no flashing vest, no protective helmet, no truck parked nearby. Just a dark figure, hunched over the steel links, hands working with unnerving precision. Marcus felt the unease crawl up his spine. Something about the figure's posture, calm, deliberate, made his instincts scream. He leaned closer to the windshield, trying to see clearer, but the fog made everything ripple and blur. Then, the figure paused. Slowly, almost mechanically, it turned its head in Marcus's direction. Even through the fog, Marcus felt the weight of that stare, cold and shapeless, as if the person were studying him, deciding something. He reached for his phone, but before he could dial, a sharp metallic snap echoed faintly through the mist. He froze. Was it real or just his mind filling in the blanks? He told investigators later that the sound didn't resemble a normal cable vibration. It was tighter. Cleaner. Like a wire being cut. A few hundred feet behind Marcus, an elderly couple, Lorraine and Peter Haskins, were inching their car forward, returning from an early morning hospital appointment. Lorraine kept her hands clasped tightly on her lap, anxious about the weather. Peter leaned forward slightly, squinting past the wipers. He had driven this bridge for 40 years. He knew its shape, its rhythm, its subtle hum. Which is why he noticed immediately when the usual underlying vibration felt wrong. Higher pitched. Sharper. As though something deep within the structure was straining to hold itself together. Lorraine remembered seeing flashes of orange, tiny sparks flickering through the fog, vanishing as quickly as they came. She thought lightning had struck far away, but Peter gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles pale. That wasn't lightning, he whispered. At 5:44 a.m., a public transit bus carrying 9 passengers rolled onto the central span. The driver, a soft-spoken man named Enrique, had taken this route for years. Nothing surprised him anymore, until that morning. He told investigators he felt an odd shift beneath the tires, a sensation like the bridge exhaled in one long, trembling breath. He slowed the bus, scanning ahead, but the fog pressed so tightly against the glass he could barely see beyond a few feet. A passenger near the front leaned in and asked, "Is something wrong?" Enrique didn't answer because he didn't know. But he felt it, everyone on that bridge did. A tension in the air, a quiet before a storm that should never have existed. Then came the first real sound. A violent, echoing pang. Metal screaming under pressure. Marcus slammed his brakes. Lorraine gasped. The bus rattled. The sound rolled through the fog like thunder trapped in a tunnel. Another pang. Followed, louder, closer, accompanied by a shudder that rippled through the pavement. Marcus looked again toward the silhouette, only this time the figure was gone. He didn't see him flee. Didn't hear footsteps. The person had simply vanished into the fog, dissolving into white nothingness. But the cables continued to groan, twisting in pain. Enrique grabbed the bus intercom. "Everyone stay seated," he said, voice shaking despite himself. "We may have a mechanical," he never finished the sentence. At 5:46 a.m., the south cable snapped. Not frayed. Not worn. Snapped. The sound was deafening, a catastrophic gunshot that ripped through the morning air. The bridge lurched violently to the left. Marcus was thrown against his steering wheel. Lorraine screamed as Peter struggled to control the car. Passengers on the bus toppled out of their seats. Metal bent. Concrete cracked. The fog swirled chaotically as if reacting to the collapse. Marcus later said it felt like the bridge was trying to tear itself free from beneath him. He slammed the truck into reverse, but the pavement buckled. Vehicles skidded, sliding toward the tilting edge. Screams filled the air, human, raw, desperate. Another cable gave out. Then another. The bridge's spine twisted. Lights flickered. The world tilted. And in the midst of the chaos, Marcus looked up one last time. Through the shifting fog, he saw it again, that same dark silhouette standing impossibly still amid the destruction, watching, expression unreadable. The figure's coat fluttered in the windless air, as though some unseen presence was pulling it back. Marcus blinked through tears and panic, trying to call out, but before he could speak, the road beneath the figure fractured and folded inward. The silhouette vanished into the abyss with the collapsing steel. When sirens finally cut through the fog minutes later, the survivors were trembling, bloodied, half-conscious. Some whispered prayers. Others stared blankly at the void where concrete should have been. But Marcus, Lorraine, Peter, and 3 bus passengers said the same thing, without prompting, without hesitation, there was someone there. Someone cutting the cables. And when they were asked how they were so certain, Marcus answered with a voice still shaking from terror. Because before the bridge fell, he turned and looked right at me. The Ravensford Bridge had always been more than a simple structure of steel and concrete. For the town, it was a symbol, of progress, of pride, of political promises that finally materialized after decades of lobbying. Local newspapers celebrated its inauguration 12 years ago with headlines like, "A New Era of Connectivity," and, "The Bridge That Will Last a Century." Engineers praised its clean lines, modern foundation, and cable-supported design that mimicked far more iconic structures. It wasn't just a bridge. It was a declaration that Ravensford was ready to grow. But behind the glossy ribbon-cutting photos and triumphant speeches, a quieter story had been unfolding, one that few noticed at the time, and even fewer wanted to remember after the collapse. It began during the construction phase, when cost overruns began piling up faster than the steel beams could be lifted into place. Investors grew impatient, politicians demanded completion before election season, and the construction firm, Braemont Infrastructure, felt the tightening pressure of both deadlines and finances. Under that strain, decisions were made. Some small. Some catastrophic. Old workers recalled whispers of rushed inspections. Night shifts where supervisors pushed teams to finish weeks of welding in a single weekend. Trucks of cheaper materials arriving unexpectedly, replacing the original orders without explanation. A few questioned it, but in construction, questioning orders often meant risking your job. So they kept building, one compromised beam at a time. Among them was a senior engineer named Victor Lorne. A man in his mid-50s, meticulous, soft-spoken, and deeply proud of his profession. He believed structures had souls, that every bolt, cable, and joint carried the responsibility of the people who built it. Victor had spent his entire career ensuring bridges didn't just stand, they endured. Which is why, during the 3rd year of construction, he found himself unable to sleep. He had been reviewing the load distribution calculations for the main suspension cables when he noticed inconsistencies. Not major enough to cause immediate alarm, but subtle enough to raise questions. The new cable shipments, identical in appearance, had slightly different tensile strength measurements. Lower ones. At first, he thought it was a clerical error. Then he noticed that these cables were part of the substituted materials that had arrived unannounced. Victor brought the issue to the site manager, who assured him it was cleared by corporate. He pushed further, emailed executives, filed internal notes, even attempted to document changes to the specifications sheet. The next week, he was removed from the project. Not fired, officially. Just reassigned to a remote inspection job 3 states away. No explanation. No acknowledgement of his concerns. His colleagues later said he looked defeated the day he left, as if a part of him knew the bridge he'd helped design was already carrying a weight far heavier than vehicles. As the years passed, small incidents began to occur. Hairline cracks in the road surface. Minor cable tension anomalies. Nothing dramatic, but enough to raise concerns among maintenance teams. The town council complained occasionally. The maintenance supervisor scheduled repairs. Yet every report ended with the same conclusion, within acceptable limits. And perhaps, technically, it was true. The bridge was never close to failing, until something changed. 2 years before the collapse, another inspector, a man named Paul Ritter, conducted a routine survey of the north support cables. He noted unusual wear patterns, too symmetrical to be weather-related and too localized to be consistent with natural fatigue. He marked it for follow-up evaluation and sent the paperwork through the proper channels. He expected a call back within a week. Instead, someone he didn't know contacted him after hours. A voice raspier than he expected. Calm. Controlled. "You should step away from this inspection," the caller said. "Any further involvement would not be good for you." Paul thought it was a prank until he found the next day's paperwork already revised, stamped as completed, and filed away without his signature. When he tried to ask, his supervisor shrugged and told him to drop it. Paul didn't push again. He had a family, children, a mortgage. Some truths weren't worth losing everything over. But he never forgot that voice. Neither did Victor, who, years after being reassigned, sent one final letter to the Ravensford Council. A warning. A plea. He wrote that the bridge was not just aging. It was vulnerable. Not structurally unsound in the traditional sense, but susceptible. Susceptible to stress. To vibration. To intentional interference. He didn't elaborate, perhaps afraid to. Perhaps unable. His letter was acknowledged, then quietly archived. And so, the Ravensford Bridge continued to stand year after year, a monument built on half-truths and overlooked flaws. Locals admired it. Tourists photographed it. Authorities boasted about it. But people like Victor and Paul carried a different memory, one that resurfaced violently when the bridge collapsed that fog-filled morning. Because when investigators later reviewed old documents, they found a handwritten note Victor had left in the margins of a blueprint, nearly forgotten: "If he returns to the site, we cannot guarantee structural stability." Nobody knew who he was. Nobody wanted to admit they had seen the warning before. But after the collapse, and after the survivors spoke of the figure cutting cables in the fog, Victor's words returned like a haunting echo. Someone had come back. In the days following the collapse, the hospital rooms where survivors recovered became quiet chambers of whispered fear and fragmented memories. Doctors focused on broken bones, concussions, and shock, but investigators were drawn to something else: an unusual consistency across the accounts of people who had never met, never spoken, never even seen each other until fate brought them all onto the Ravensford Bridge that morning. 3 of them, in particular, would become the center of the investigation: Marcus Hale, the delivery driver; Lorraine Haskins, the elderly woman who had clutched her husband's arm moments before the collapse; and a university student named Aisha Clark, who had been sitting near the front of the public transit bus. Each one was interviewed separately. Each one gave their statement without hearing the others. And yet, disturbingly, their descriptions lined up with uncanny precision. Marcus was the first. Still bandaged across his forehead, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, he spoke with a trembling voice. He described the shape he saw crouched by the cables: tall, lean, wearing something long and dark, like a heavy coat. The figure's movements were deft, almost practiced. Marcus swore he saw something glint in the figure's hands, though he couldn't make out the tool through the fog. But the most terrifying detail wasn't what the man was doing. It was how still the world felt around him, as if the fog itself paused, trapping the moment in silence. When investigators asked Marcus to clarify whether the figure might have been a hallucination or a misinterpretation of shadows, he sat up straighter, his voice suddenly firm. "Hallucinations don't turn their head and look directly at you," he said. "They don't watch you like they're deciding whether you matter." 2 floors above him, in a separate wing of the hospital, Lorraine Haskins was recounting her own story. She clutched the edge of her blanket with both hands as she spoke, occasionally glancing at the door, as though afraid the figure might drift through it at any moment. Lorraine described seeing tiny bursts of orange light, sparks, near the cables. She thought they were reflections at first, but then she noticed movement. A silhouette. A human form bending over the metal, pausing, adjusting something, working with unnatural calmness while the fog wrapped around them like a shroud. When asked to describe the person, Lorraine surprised investigators. She didn't hesitate. "He wore a coat," she said. "A long one. Maybe dark gray or black. It was hard to tell with the fog. But the shoulders," she frowned, searching for the right word. "Rigid. Like the coat was too stiff or the person stood too straight. Too still." Peter, her husband, hadn't seen the figure directly, but he confirmed seeing the faint sparks. The only reason he didn't notice the silhouette sooner was because he was focused on the strange, irregular vibrations running through the steering wheel, vibrations he swore felt too sharp, too unnatural to be part of normal bridge resonance. The third major testimony came from 19-year-old university student Aisha Clark. Soft-spoken and visibly shaken, she had survived the collapse with only minor injuries but carried a heavy emotional burden. She told investigators she noticed something unusual minutes before the collapse, not outside the bus, but inside. A sensation. A tension among the passengers that hadn't been there moments earlier. She described looking out through the front windshield when the driver slowed the bus. And there, in the swirling whiteness, she saw what Marcus and Lorraine had, a dark figure standing near the cables, sparks arcing briefly around their hands. Aisha added a detail that neither Marcus nor Lorraine mentioned. She said the figure's coat seemed to blend into the fog, almost dissolving at the edges, making it difficult to tell where fabric ended and mist began. This detail made her doubt herself at first, worry that trauma had warped her memory. But then investigators showed her silhouettes of common maintenance uniforms, construction vests, engineering workwear. She shook her head at every single one. "This wasn't a worker," she whispered. "It didn't look like someone doing maintenance. It looked like someone trying not to be seen." Another unusual element surfaced as Aisha continued. She insisted she heard a faint rhythmic sound, almost like a metallic heartbeat, steady, controlled. Not chaotic like snapping cables, but deliberate. She described it as tick-tick-tick, soft but sharp enough to slice through the silence of the fog. Investigators wondered if it was the sound of a cutting tool, but the rhythm she described didn't match common equipment. It was too clean. Too precise. When investigators compared notes, the parallels became impossible to dismiss. All 3 survivors described the same height range. The same coat length. The same posture. The same unnatural stillness. The same sense of being watched by someone whose intentions were unreadable. There was another detail, one the investigators tried not to emphasize too quickly, but it hung heavily over the interviews like a constant shadow. Marcus had seen the figure crouched near the south cable. Lorraine saw sparks near the midspan. Aisha saw the silhouette standing closer to the center of the bridge. 3 different positions. 3 different moments. All before the collapse. No single person could have moved that fast across the bridge, unless they were there much longer than anyone realized, working methodically, unnoticed until the fog shifted just enough to reveal them. When investigators gently proposed the idea that perhaps all 3 survivors were misinterpreting shadows or natural reflections in the fog, Aisha responded with a quiet but chilling statement: "Shadows don't create sparks. And they don't hold tools. Marcus, when told that other survivors hadn't seen anything, replied, some people weren't looking. Or the fog hid him. But he was there. I know what I saw. Lorraine simply shivered and whispered, he didn't run. He didn't panic. Even when the bridge started to fall. He just disappeared. The chilling consistency of their accounts forced investigators to consider something they hoped they would never have to entertain, that the survivors hadn't merely imagined a figure on the bridge. Someone had been there. Someone who knew exactly where to cut. Someone comfortable in the fog. And if 3 unrelated people saw him, then the collapse might not have been an accident at all. In the first 48 hours after the collapse, the city spiraled into shock. News helicopters hovered over the river, capturing the twisted wreckage of the Ravensford Bridge as recovery teams combed through debris. Reporters demanded answers. Families demanded justice. But behind the scenes, a different, quieter war had already begun, one fought not with rescue equipment or engineering tools, but with politics, pressure, and the careful shaping of a narrative no one wanted to unravel. Detective Jonathan Reyes was assigned as the lead investigator. At 41, he carried the posture of a man who'd seen more loss than victory. His younger brother, Daniel, had died 5 years earlier in a construction accident, another case where truth was buried under corporate excuses. That grief never left him. It sharpened him, hardened him, pushed him into a kind of relentless determination most colleagues admired but few truly understood. When he arrived at the collapse site, uniform still dusted with travel grit, he stared at the mangled steel and sinking shadows with a hollow expression that veered dangerously close to déjà vu. Another structure. Another preventable tragedy. Another unanswered question. Within hours of the collapse, representatives from Braemont Infrastructure, the company that had designed and built the bridge, appeared at the command center, too quickly, some thought. They brought binders, rehearsed talking points, and a carefully curated timeline showing their compliance with safety regulations. Their spokesperson, polished and controlled, reiterated over and over that the collapse was likely the result of unforeseen structural stress combined with weather conditions. Fog and stress. Convenient words. Predictable ones. Reyes didn't buy them. City officials echoed the same message, claiming they wanted to prevent panic. But even in those early hours, there were signs, subtle, hair-thin cracks in the official facade, that something was being concealed. Engineering teams sent by Braemont were given exclusive access to crucial evidence before independent investigators could examine it. Certain documents were sealed without explanation. Requests for maintenance logs were delayed. Reyes watched all of this with growing suspicion. He wasn't the only one uneasy. Insurance investigators hovered nearby, quietly taking photos, whispering among themselves. The financial implications of the collapse were enormous, hundreds of millions in damages, lawsuits looming, political careers at stake. Everyone had something to lose. And when that much money and reputation were on the line, truth often became the first casualty. But within the noise, a smaller detail began to stand out, the survivors' testimonies about the mysterious figure. Reyes listened to their accounts himself, sitting in dim hospital rooms, his notebook open, pen tapping lightly against the page. Marcus. Lorraine. Aisha. Each described the same silhouette cutting cables. Each insisted what they saw wasn't a trick of the fog. Reyes didn't dismiss them like others did. He had learned long ago that truth rarely came from the most convenient sources, it always hid in the tremor of a voice, the detail someone couldn't forget, the thing that made no sense until it suddenly made all the sense in the world. Still, he needed evidence. Hard proof. Something tangible. The bridge had several security cameras installed along the span, standard protocol for infrastructure of its size. They were motion-triggered, high-resolution, designed to capture everything from traffic violations to maintenance anomalies. If someone had been on the bridge that morning, if a figure had crouched near the cables, sparks flying in the fog, a camera should have caught it. So Reyes ordered the retrieval of the footage. And that was when the investigation shifted. The technician, a young man who looked too nervous for someone simply retrieving files, reported that the footage from a crucial 30-minute window, 5:15 to 5:45 a.m., was missing. Deleted. Not corrupted. Not lost. Deleted. And the access logs confirmed it was done manually. By who? Reyes asked. The technician swallowed. Someone logged in remotely. Administrator credentials. Braemont Infrastructure had administrative access. City engineers had administrative access. A few senior officials in the Department of Transportation had administrative access. Reyes felt his stomach tighten. Manual deletion meant someone knew exactly when to erase, exactly what to hide. Someone wanted the public to believe the collapse was an accident. And the existence of a figure cutting cables on the bridge would shatter that narrative instantly. When Reyes demanded answers from Braemont's spokesperson, the man responded calmly, almost rehearsed, "Detective, if footage is missing, it was likely a technical malfunction. We have no reason to believe foul play was involved." But it wasn't his words that bothered Reyes, it was the way he avoided eye contact, the brief flicker of tension in his jaw, the look of someone who knew more than he was willing to say. Later that evening, as Reyes sifted through preliminary reports, a senior city official approached him with a request disguised as friendly advice. "Reyes," the official said, "we need you to keep the investigation focused. People are grieving. Businesses are shutting down. We can't fuel conspiracies. Stick to structural causes for now." Reyes stared at him. "We follow the evidence." "Of course," the official replied, offering a tight smile. "Just, be strategic about what evidence is worth pursuing." The message was clear, they didn't want a criminal investigation. They wanted closure. But Reyes wasn't done. He retrieved what remained of the undamaged technical logs. He interviewed maintenance staff. He compared timestamps from various sources. And late that night, under the dim light of his desk lamp, he found something unsettling, a log entry showing that the bridge vibration sensors had detected unusual frequency spikes hours before the collapse. Spikes that should have triggered alarms. Spikes that someone had muted. Muted. Manually. Reyes leaned back in his chair, pulse rising. None of this was coincidence. Someone had been on that bridge. Someone who knew how to bypass systems, override logs, and cut cables precisely without leaving immediate forensic traces. The next morning, Reyes received a call from a frightened maintenance worker. The man spoke in whispers. "Detective, someone told me not to talk about the cameras. They said it was better for everyone if we stuck to the official explanation." "Who told you that?" Reyes asked. A long silence followed. Then the worker whispered a name Reyes recognized instantly because it belonged to someone with both motive and opportunity. But before the worker could say anything else, someone spoke to him from the background. The call ended abruptly. Reyes stared at his silent phone for several seconds, a chill running up his spine. The bridge had fallen, but someone was still controlling what remained of the story. And now, he understood something with haunting clarity, the truth wasn't just being overlooked. It was being silenced. Deliberately. Strategically. And the person who deleted the footage, the person who stood in the fog with sparks dancing around them, was still out there. Detective Reyes first heard the name Elias Mercer while sifting through old complaint files stacked in dusty metal drawers in the municipal records room. The name appeared more than once, handwritten notes, formal reports, internal memos, even emails with vague subject lines like, "concerns regarding structural integrity," and, "request to review cable specifications." Elias had been one of the senior engineers assigned to the Ravensford Bridge project during its mid-phase construction. But what stood out most was not his credentials or his technical expertise, it was the abrupt, unexplained way he disappeared from the project, and eventually, from the engineering world entirely. As Reyes dug deeper, a pattern emerged. Elias had raised alarms about the construction materials, specifically the cables. He claimed that the substitutions Braemont Infrastructure approved were below spec, that the metal quality didn't match the original contract, and that continued use posed catastrophic risk under stress. His warnings were met with silence, then pushback, then hostility. A memo written by a project supervisor, polite on the surface but cold beneath, stated that Elias's behavior has become disruptive and counterproductive to timeline efficiency. 2 months after submitting his final report, Elias resigned. Or so the records claimed. But the resignation letter felt forced, 2 lines, typed, and signed, more like something drafted by legal rather than written by a frightened engineer. After that, his name vanished from public records except for a brief note showing he'd withdrawn from 2 professional engineering associations. No disciplinary action. No complaints filed against him. Just silence. A man erased from a project he once dedicated years to. Reyes knew people didn't simply walk away from careers they spent their lives building. Something had driven Elias out. Something powerful. Something dangerous. The more Reyes read, the more unsettled he became. One police report filed by Elias 3 years after the bridge opened described a threatening encounter outside his apartment building. He claimed a man in a dark coat approached him late at night, warning him to stop digging into things that were already settled. The report went nowhere, no suspects identified, no evidence found, case closed within a week. But the detail of the coat struck Reyes immediately, echoing the survivors' descriptions of the figure in the fog. A week into the bridge investigation, a new lead emerged. A middle-aged dock worker named Ray knew Elias from years back. Nervous and visibly conflicted, Ray told Reyes something that put Elias squarely in the spotlight. The night before the collapse, Ray said he saw a man matching Elias's build walking along the eastern pedestrian path of the bridge, alone, hands in pockets, long coat brushing the railing. Ray didn't think much of it at the time. People occasionally walked the bridge in the early morning to watch the water, clear their minds, or simply pass through. But after hearing about the collapse and the reports of someone tampering with the cables, Ray felt compelled to come forward. When Reyes asked if the man had been carrying anything, Ray hesitated. Not at first, he said. But when he got closer to the midpoint, I thought I saw something, like a hard case. Thin. Long. He gestured with his hands, showing a narrow rectangular shape. A tool case, perhaps. Something a person could use to carry equipment. The moment Ray finished describing it, Reyes felt the weight of responsibility settle on him. Elias had motive, anger, disillusionment, betrayal. He had knowledge, the cable specifications, the structural vulnerabilities, the blind spots in the maintenance schedule. And now, witnesses placed him near the bridge hours before it fell. But Reyes didn't want to jump to conclusions. He'd seen cases where angry men looked guilty only because their suffering was easy to interpret as rage. He had seen broken careers turn into convenient narratives for those eager to assign blame. He knew better than to assume that a disgraced engineer automatically became a saboteur. He needed more. Reyes tracked down Elias's last known address, an old apartment complex on the outskirts of town. Dust-covered mailboxes. Faded numbers on the doors. A sense of abandonment hanging in the hallways. The landlord, a tired man with thinning hair and a permanent frown, said Elias had moved out years earlier. Alone. Quiet. Paid in cash. Strange guy, the landlord added. Smart, but paranoid. Always looking over his shoulder. Reyes asked if Elias left a forwarding address. The landlord shook his head. He didn't want to be found. But fear often leaves traces even when people try to disappear. One neighbor, a woman who remembered Elias as polite but haunted, recalled seeing him pacing the hallway at odd hours. Sometimes he muttered under his breath, other times he stopped abruptly, listening as if someone was following him. She said he once told her, in a rare moment of vulnerability, that people don't forgive you for telling the truth. Elias's disappearance suddenly felt less like guilt and more like desperation. Still, the timeline pointed toward him. The witness sighting. His history with the bridge. The warnings he tried to give. The threats he received. The mysterious resignation. All of it formed a dark, jagged puzzle that investigators couldn't ignore. Then came the most damning piece of early evidence. A fisherman who had anchored near the bridge before dawn reported seeing a lone figure walking along the maintenance beams beneath the deck, where workers sometimes inspected the cable housings. He couldn't make out the face, but the coat was unmistakable. Long, dark. Heavy. And the height matched descriptions of Elias from old employee ID photos. Reyes felt his pulse spike. Elias had the technical capacity to sabotage the bridge. He knew the weak points. He knew which cables bore the most load at specific times of year. He knew how to move unseen along structural beams. And he had been treated unjustly, dismissed, threatened, silenced. Was this his revenge? His warning to the world finally unleashed in the most brutal way? Or was he being framed by someone who knew investigators would follow this trail straight to him? As Reyes examined the witness statements again, a cold unease settled over him. One detail across all accounts remained consistent: the figure in the fog moved with precision. Confidence. Purpose. If Elias had been mentally unstable or terrified for his safety, would he have approached the bridge so calmly? Reyes wasn't convinced. Still, the evidence was strong enough to label Elias Mercer as the first official suspect. But something deeper tugged at Reyes's instincts, something he couldn't articulate yet. A quiet voice, familiar and persistent, whispering that the truth was hiding underneath the surface. And that Elias, disgraced and forgotten, might hold answers no one else could give. If only he could be found. Detective Reyes had dealt with corporate stonewalling before, but nothing prepared him for the labyrinth Braemont infrastructure had constructed around the Ravensford Bridge. Every request he filed seemed to disappear into an administrative void. Maintenance logs arrived redacted, inspection reports came with missing pages, and email archives contained long stretches of data unavailable due to system error. It was too much coincidence. Too much conveniently missing information. The louder the public demanded clarity, the quieter the company became. Reyes, frustrated but undeterred, turned to the one place bureaucratic oversight often forgot: the physical archives. Hidden in a dim storage room beneath the Department of Transportation building, he found rows of filing cabinets, untouched, unindexed, and thick with dust. It was there, among yellow documents and rusted metal drawers, that he uncovered the first real thread of the cover-up. A stack of internal memos from the early construction period, stamped, confidential, internal use only. The memos documented material substitutions, exactly the kind Elias Mercer had argued against. Phrases like cost efficiency, deadline compliance, and acceptable variance were sprinkled across pages, but what chilled Reyes most was a note scribbled in the margin of one memo: proceed regardless. External auditors won't detect variance at this stage. He read it twice. Then a third time. This wasn't ignorance. It wasn't negligence. It was intentional. Someone knew the materials were inferior. Someone approved them anyway. But why? As Reyes continued searching, he found engineering reports that had never been publicly disclosed. They detailed stress anomalies in several key cables, anomalies that were dismissed without proper investigation. One document referenced symmetrical where inconsistent with environmental exposure. The phrasing stopped Reyes cold. Symmetrical where meant deliberate force. Something manipulated. Something tampered with. And not by accident. He dug deeper until he located a folder tucked behind a stack of outdated bridge inspection manuals. The folder was unmarked. Inside, He found a series of emails between Braemont executives discussing budget shortfalls, investor pressures, and political timelines that had to be met at all costs. One executive wrote bluntly, "We can't afford another delay. If adjustments need to be made to pass inspection, do it quietly. No more whistleblowers." The timestamp on that message was dated just weeks before Elias Mercer was removed from the project. The room felt smaller. The air seemed heavier. Every clue pointed to a culture of concealment, one that began during construction and continued long after the bridge opened to the public. But there was more. A lot more. The most significant discovery came in the form of a maintenance log referencing a contractor whose name Reyes didn't recognize, J. Harrow. Listed only once. No official ID number. No attached credentials. The note beside his name simply read, "Consultation completed. Issue resolved." The issue was listed as, "cable tension irregularity." But no report followed. No evidence of what he had done, what he had found, or why he was hired unofficially rather than through the standard approval system. A ghost name on a ghost assignment that seemed to serve no clear purpose. Reyes circled the name. Something about it felt wrong. Forced. Inserted. As if someone wanted it there just enough to acknowledge a problem existed, while ensuring no one could trace it further. He wasn't the only one noticing unusual patterns. A quiet, cautious forensic accountant named Megan Vinter had been assisting with financial tracing on the investigation. She approached Reyes in the hallway, her expression tight with worry. "There are discrepancies," she said. "Huge ones. Funds moved to shell companies. Unexplained payments labeled as consulting fees. Some transactions look like they were routed through fake vendors. One payment," she explained, "was especially troubling, made to an entity that dissolved 3 days after receiving funds." Reyes felt a familiar anger rise in his chest. This wasn't sabotage in isolation. It was part of a larger network, a larger motive, a larger truth buried beneath years of silence. Something corporate. Something calculated. But the most startling discovery came when Reyes managed to track down a portion of the bridge's original structural modeling files. Hidden among the complex diagrams was a flagged note written by one of the junior engineers at the time. It read, "If external strain is applied at anchor point C, failure could cascade deeper than projected. Recommend additional reinforcement." The reply from a supervisor was immediate, "Not approved. Too costly. Risk minimal." Reyes studied the diagram. Anchor point C was one of the exact cables survivors reported seeing sparks near. The same cable the vibration sensors detected anomalies around before the collapse. The same area the mysterious figure was seen crouched over in the fog. He felt the pieces aligning, but not into a straightforward picture. Instead, they formed a tangled, uncomfortable truth: the bridge had always been at risk, but only to those who knew where to push it. Someone with knowledge, engineering knowledge, could exploit the vulnerabilities Braemont ignored. Someone with intent could cause the structure to fail in a way that appeared accidental, unless one looked closely enough to see the cuts, the patterns, the suppressed data. The final blow came from a damaged digital file recovered by a tech specialist late one night. The file contained a draft of a report prepared by a safety inspector named Harold Clemens, a report that was never published. In it, Clemens wrote that irregular cable wear from his last inspection suggested interference. He wanted a deeper investigation. A pause of operations. A thorough forensic review. But in the margin of the document, a note from a superior overrode him: "Drop this. Do not escalate. If he returns to the site, we cannot guarantee structural stability." That word again. He. Not they. Not unknown party. But he. A specific individual. Someone Braemont already knew about. Someone whose involvement they feared, and anticipated. Reyes stared at the note long after he'd memorized it. Someone had visited the bridge years earlier. Someone who understood its flaws intimately. Someone Braymont expected might return. The cover-up spanned more than budget cuts or silence. It spanned years. Decisions. Threats. Suppressed reports. And a company more worried about profit margins than human lives. But one question now echoed louder than all the rest: was the collapse a tragic consequence of corruption, or had someone deliberately triggered a weakness that should never have existed? Reyes knew the answer was close. But so was the danger. And whoever he was, had now stepped out of the shadows and into the fog. The moment Detective Reyes found the name Elias Mercer scribbled across documents, memos, and forgotten inspection files, he knew he had to track the man down. But finding Elias proved far more difficult than predicted. People who'd once worked with him remembered him vaguely: a quiet presence, a man who loved mathematics more than conversation, someone who always carried a notebook and sketched cable tension diagrams even during lunch breaks. Yet every lead ended the same way: Elias had vanished, slipping out of society like a ghost determined never to be seen again. Reyes followed a trail of old addresses, bank withdrawals, and employment records that grew fainter with each passing year. Elias had moved constantly: small towns, rural outskirts, temporary jobs that lasted no more than a few months. But something strange emerged when Reyes studied these movements: each location was near a bridge, dam, or large public structure. It was as though Elias had spent the last decade circling engineering projects, studying them quietly, like a man unable to let go of his past, or haunted by what he once helped build. The trail eventually led Reyes to a remote, decaying cabin deep inside the forested hills outside Ravensford. The locals knew the property only as the old Mercer place, though none had seen Elias in years. The cabin looked abandoned, its porch sagging, windows darkened, a rusted lantern hanging crookedly by the door. But when Reyes approached, he saw signs of recent habitation: footprints in the dirt, a thin line of smoke curling from a metal chimney pipe, and a faint metallic clicking sound coming from inside. He knocked once. Silence. Then a shadow moved behind the curtain, and a voice, hoarse, cautious, said, "Who is it?" "Detective Jonathan Reyes," he answered. "I'm here about the Ravensford Bridge." The door remained closed for several long, breath-held moments. Reyes wondered if the man inside might flee through a back exit. But finally, the door creaked open, revealing Elias Mercer for the first time in nearly a decade. He was thinner than his photos suggested, with graying hair, sunken eyes, and a posture bent more from burden than age. His face carried a mix of suspicion, exhaustion, and quiet intelligence. "If you're here to accuse me," Elias said without greeting, "you're wasting your time." Reyes didn't push inside. "I'm here because people died, Mr. Mercer. And I think you know why." Elias studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside without a word, allowing Reyes into the cabin. Inside, the air smelled of dust, old paper, and cold metal. Maps and engineering blueprints were pinned to every wall: bridges, cable structures, stress diagrams, even sketches of the Ravensford Bridge from its earliest design stages. Tables were cluttered with calipers, metal fragments, notebooks filled with scrawled equations. It looked less like a home and more like a bunker of a man trying to solve a problem that wouldn't let him sleep. Reyes scanned the room. "You've been keeping records." "I document what others ignore," Elias said, voice steady but tired. "It's all I know how to do." Reyes asked him where he had been the night of the collapse. Elias didn't hesitate. "Here. Alone. I don't go near that bridge anymore." His tone hardened. "Not after what they did to it. And to me." Reyes waited, letting the silence press lightly on Elias until the man continued. "They built it wrong," Elias said quietly. "They weakened it. Lied about the materials. Cut corners. I tried to stop them, and they pushed me out. They threatened me. They made me the problem instead of the flaws. Reyes had heard versions of this from old colleagues, but hearing it directly from Elias carried a weight nothing else had. Still, he needed to address the evidence. There were sightings, Reyes said. A man in a long coat near the cables hours before the collapse. Someone moving along the beams. Someone who knew what they were doing. Elias didn't react with surprise or indignation. Instead, his expression shifted into something far more unsettling, recognition. That wasn't me, he said firmly. But I know who it could have been. Reyes felt a chill run up his spine. Elias crossed the room and opened a wooden box. Inside lay small fragments of steel, some polished, others jagged. He selected one and handed it to Reyes. The metal shard was smooth along one edge, unnaturally so, as if cut by a tool designed to slice through industrial-grade cable with surgical precision. This, Elias said, is from the Ravensford Bridge. I collected it years ago when I inspected the early cable wear. Reyes stared at him. You kept a piece of the bridge? I kept what they tried to hide, Elias replied sharply. That cut wasn't natural. It wasn't stress. It wasn't decay. Someone caused it deliberately. Someone who understood exactly where to apply force. Reyes studied the fragment, feeling its coldness against his palm. Who? He asked softly. Elias hesitated, the first sign of fear flickering in his eyes. There was a man. A contractor they brought in unofficially. No records. No identity checks. He worked at night sometimes, alone. I confronted a supervisor once and asked who he was. They told me he was a specialist hired to solve tension irregularities. He looked directly at Reyes. But he wasn't solving anything. He was studying the weaknesses. Reyes's pulse quickened. This aligned with everything he had found buried in the archives, the suppressed reports, the phantom contractor, the internal warnings. What was his name? Reyes asked. Elias breathed out slowly. I only heard him referred to as Harrow. The name echoed in Reyes's mind. He had seen it once, scribbled in a maintenance log, with no details, no history, no trace. Elias continued, voice tight with dread. I saw him near the cables once. He moved like someone who belonged there. No hesitation. No confusion. When he saw me watching, he didn't look startled. He just stared at me, coldly. Like he was calculating whether I was a threat. Reyes remembered the survivor's words describing the exact same gaze. Elias sank into a chair, hands trembling slightly. I reported it. They told me to leave it alone. Weeks later, I was forced out. Reyes stepped closer. Elias, if Harrow returned to the bridge that morning, he did, Elias whispered. I know he did. That bridge didn't just fail. It was triggered. Exploited. Used. The room felt colder suddenly. Reyes watched Elias carefully. Why give this to me now? Why trust me? Elias looked up, his eyes haunted but steady. Because someone made sure the bridge could collapse. But someone else ensured it actually did. And the people who hired Harrow, they won't let the truth come out. He gestured toward the window, toward the forest that separated his isolated cabin from the rest of the world. I left because I thought disappearing would keep me alive. But the collapse proves one thing, detective, running doesn't stop them. Reyes closed his fingers around the cable fragment. The precision of the cut matched nothing found in standard tools. It was too clean. Too intentional. This was no random act. It was a signature. A calling card. Elias leaned forward, voice barely above a whisper. If you want the truth, you won't find it in their reports. You'll find it in the people they paid to make sure the bridge lasted long enough, and failed exactly when they needed it to. Reyes felt the weight of the investigation shift in that moment, not away from Elias, but deeper into the shadows Elias had spent years running from. And if Harrow truly existed, and if he had returned to the bridge, then Reyes wasn't searching for a disgraced engineer anymore. He was hunting a ghost train to make disasters look like accidents. A man who knew how to vanish into the fog. And that man was still out there. Detective Reyes left Elias Mercer's cabin with the cable fragment still cold in his hand, the name Harrow echoing through his thoughts like an unanswered riddle. Up until this point, Elias had been the most convenient suspect, angry, disappeared, seen near the bridge. But now a darker, far more calculated figure entered the story. A man who was never supposed to exist in the first place. Reyes returned to his office determined to find any trace of Harrow, birth records, employment history, contractor logs, ID photos, anything. Yet every search yielded nothing but digital silence. No social security number. No certifications. No residential address. It was as if Harrow lived entirely off the grid. But off-the-grid people didn't get hired for major infrastructure consultation, unless someone intentionally wanted them untraceable. The one clue Reyes did have was the maintenance log, cable tension irregularity, issue resolved by J. Harrow. It was hastily typed, the formatting different from the rest of the entries. Even the ink color looked slightly off. That alone would be suspicious, but paired with Elias's testimony, the log became far more chilling. It was proof, however small, that this man had been physically present on the bridge years earlier. Reyes decided to visit the maintenance supervisor who'd signed off on that entry. Bernard Foley. A round-faced man with thinning blonde hair and a nervous habit of pushing up his glasses every few seconds. He looked exhausted when Reyes arrived at his home, dark circles beneath his eyes, movements twitchy, as though waiting for something terrible to happen. When Reyes confronted him about Harrow, Foley tensed. His jaw clenched, his hands fidgeted, and for several seconds, he said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he offered the first confirmation Reyes needed. He wasn't supposed to be on the records, Foley said. He wasn't part of the company. Who hired him? Reyes asked. Foley shook his head. I don't know. Orders came from above. Much above. Describe him. Foley stared into his living room as though trying to piece together memories he'd spent years trying to bury. Tall, he said. Too tall for heavy workwear. He wore a dark coat, almost like a military field coat, but not standard issue. He didn't speak much. Only asked to be shown the anchor points. He moved like he already knew the layout. And the work he did? Reyes pressed. Foley swallowed. I never saw him use normal tools. He carried this case. Thin, metallic. Opened like a surgical kit. The tools inside weren't standard. I didn't recognize any of them. This matched the fisherman's statement about the thin rectangular case seen near the beams. Reyes pulled from his pocket the cable fragment Elias had given him. Would a tool in his kit make a cut like this? Foley stepped back as though the metal were radioactive. Detective, I've never seen anything cut steel cable that cleanly. But if anyone could, it was him. Reyes wanted more, but Foley refused to speak further. He shut down, eyes darting to the windows as if expecting someone to be watching. That someone might have been. The next breakthrough came unexpectedly, from a fisherman named Carl Denner who had been on the river the morning of the collapse. His boat had drifted beneath the bridge just minutes before the cables snapped. When interviewed, Carl mentioned something Reyes hadn't heard before: he had taken a photo. A blurry, fog-drenched image captured from below the bridge deck. Carl pulled out his old phone, scrolling through grainy river photos until he found it. Reyes leaned in. There, barely visible through the fog, stood a silhouette on the lower maintenance platform. Tall. Lean. Coat fluttering despite the still air. The figure's posture was identical to the survivors' descriptions. Calm. Methodical. almost statuesque amid the mist. A faint shower of sparks rained downward, flickering against the metal beams before disappearing into the river fog. The image was imperfect, shaky from the rocking boat, but unmistakable. It was the first physical evidence of the figure on the bridge. Reyes examined the lighting, angle, and timeliness. Carl confirmed the timestamp, 5:42 a.m. The exact minute survivors reported seeing the mysterious man above. Reyes's heartbeat quickened. "Did he see you?" Carl hesitated. "I think so." At one point he paused. His head turned, maybe toward me. But I couldn't see his face. He shuddered. Felt like he was weighing something. Like deciding whether I mattered. The exact same eerie feeling Marcus and Aisha described. Reyes now had survivors' testimonies, old logs, Elias's warning, and an actual photo. The pieces began forming a terrifying outline of a man capable of engineering a collapse with surgical precision, timing it perfectly for maximum effect. But motive remained elusive. Why would Harrow return to the bridge after years? Why cut the cables? Why cause a collapse now? As Reyes searched further into the archived financial records Megan Vinter had flagged, he found something stunning, a payout. Nearly 5 figures. Labeled under a shell consulting company. Paid out 3 weeks before the collapse. The account closed immediately after distribution. The recipient? Listed only as J. Harrow. A chilling possibility crept into Reyes's mind: Harrow hadn't been acting alone. He had been hired, again. But unlike before, this wasn't about surveying or studying the bridge's weaknesses. This time, someone wanted the bridge to fall. Reyes dug deeper into Harrow's history, what little there was. References emerged in obscure industry whispers: a nameless contractor who handled sensitive assignments, someone companies called when they needed untraceable work done, someone known only through word-of-mouth channels. A ghost with a skill set that straddled engineering, sabotage, and covert operations. Not a disgruntled employee. Not a conspiracy theorist. Not an amateur saboteur. A professional. Reyes returned to the photo, zooming into the silhouette over and over, searching for details. The coat, long, heavy, likely reinforced. The stance, balanced on narrow beams without hesitation. The sparks, coming from a handheld device emitting a controlled, precise spark. Nothing about the figure's posture suggested panic or improvisation. He was calm. Steady. Efficient. A man who had done this before. A man who knew the fog would cover him. A man who worked best unseen. Reyes realized something horrifying: the collapse wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act. It was a calculated operation. The fog that morning wasn't just weather, it was a shield, a curtain Harrow had likely studied in weather reports. The timing matched shift changes and camera blind spots. The cable cuts were executed with exact precision needed to trigger sequential failure. This was engineering knowledge weaponized. Someone had hired Harrow to destroy the Ravensford Bridge. But the biggest question remained: why this bridge? Why now? As Reyes pinned the blurry photo onto his investigation board, Elias's trembling voice echoed back to him: he returned to finish what he started. And now Reyes knew, the person in the fog wasn't just a figure survivors saw. He was the key to unraveling everything. But finding him meant stepping into the same fog Harrow moved through so comfortably. And men like Harrow didn't leave witnesses twice. Reconstructing the final hour before the Ravensford Bridge collapse became one of the most complex tasks Detective Reyes and the forensic team had ever undertaken. Not only was the physical evidence fragmented beneath tons of water and twisted steel, but the fog had obscured visual confirmation from every angle. Yet through survivor testimonies, sensor readings, maintenance logs, and newly uncovered documents, a chillingly precise, minute-by-minute timeline began to form, one that suggested something far more deliberate than any natural failure. The fog rolled in around 4:55 a.m., thickening rapidly over the river. Weather records confirmed visibility dropped below 50 feet, an unusually sharp decline that seemed almost staged. Fog this dense wasn't typical for early spring, but storms from the previous night had created pockets of cold air that settled unpredictably. It was the perfect cover, the perfect backdrop for someone who needed to move unseen. At 5:07 a.m., Ravensford's vibration sensors recorded their first anomaly, a low-frequency tremor originating near the midspan anchor point C, the same area flagged in Elias Mercer's old reports. Ordinarily, such a reading would have triggered an automatic alert to maintenance headquarters. But that night, for reasons that increasingly pointed toward sabotage, the alert system had been manually silenced. The logs showed the override was input from a remote console. At 5:12 a.m., traffic increased slightly. 5 vehicles entered the bridge, a sedan, a delivery truck, a city bus, and 2 early commuters. Nothing unusual. Nothing suspicious. Yet hidden from their sight, another presence had already entered the structure minutes earlier. Forensic modeling suggested that Harrow, or whoever the shadowy figure was, likely accessed the bridge around 5:08 a.m., through the eastern maintenance walkway. This area, rarely monitored, provided direct access to the lower beams. From there, the intruder could reach the cable anchor housings without detection. The fisherman's photo timestamped at 5:42 a.m. confirmed the figure was still operating beneath the deck, but the cuts must have begun long before. At 5:15 a.m., emergency logs showed a second spike in cable vibration near the north supports, short, sharp, rhythmic. Forensic acousticians later matched this to the metallic resonance of cable fibers under directional pressure. Not tearing, not fraying, but being intentionally weakened. This rhythmic vibration eerily matched Aisha's description of the tick-tick-tick sound she'd heard minutes before the collapse. Survivors' testimonies lined up with these readings. Marcus Hale reported seeing a silhouette crouched over the left cables around 5:18 a.m. Lorraine saw sparks near the center span around the same window. These observations, though fragmented and obscured by fog, fit perfectly into the timeline. At 5:27 a.m., a series of microfractures occurred in the south cable. Analytic reconstruction later showed these fractures were not random, they were inflicted in a pattern. The cuts were positioned in a staggered formation, each weakening a specific load-bearing segment. Under natural circumstances, such symmetrical fractures do not occur. They were too clean, too aligned, too consistent with tool-induced damage. This meant the figure wasn't merely slicing cables, he was engineering a collapse. By 5:30 a.m., less than 15 minutes from failure, the fog became even denser. Satellite weather data showed a brief drop in wind speed at the bridge's altitude, causing the fog to compress and settle. Visibility dropped to near zero. If the intruder needed darkness and concealment, this was the moment. And he used it. Harrow, if indeed it was him, likely transitioned from the lower platform to the upper beam network around this time. He would have done so using the internal ladder system, moving quietly, quickly, with full awareness of the bridge's structural map. The survivors' sightings during this period confirm his presence above the roadway rather than below it. Marcus reported noticing the silhouette standing after crouching, while Lorraine saw sparks higher up on the cable line. At 5:36 a.m., the cable tension monitors registered an abrupt fluctuation. A distinctive dip, as if the anchor point suddenly experienced a rapid load shift. This type of shift only happens when a major cable is compromised, severed enough to affect distribution but not enough to snap completely. This was the moment forensic teams later identified as the execution point. The point of no return. At 5:40 a.m., Enrique's bus entered the center span. This introduced additional weight, but in a normal setting, the bridge could easily handle it. Yet on this morning, the compromised cables fell below safety tolerance. The additional mass accelerated the inevitable. It was around this time, 5:41 to 5:42 a.m., that Carl Denner captured the now famous blurry photo. A lone figure standing on the lower maintenance platform. The angle and lighting made facial recognition impossible, but the posture, the calmness, matched every survivor's account. Reyes stared at this photo dozens of times during the reconstruction. Every time, he felt the same chilling impression: the figure wasn't panicked. Wasn't rushing. Whoever it was, they knew precisely how long the structure would hold. They had calculated their window perfectly. At 5:43 a.m., a final vibration spike registered in the south support. This spike was different, sharp, catastrophic. Structural engineers later identified this as the moment the last stabilizing strands failed. The cable didn't merely snap. It ruptured along a plane previously weakened by a precision cut. From that moment, the collapse became inevitable. At 5:44 a.m., Marcus heard the first metallic scream. The bridge jolted. The sound rolled through the fog like a warning too late to be heard. The pavement shifted sideways, slanting as the south cable gave way. Vehicles skidded into distorted angles. Drivers screamed. Passengers braced themselves. The survivors remembered the fog behaving strangely, as though spiraling around the collapsing structure, swallowing beams and screams alike. At 5:45 a.m., the main span twisted, dragging the road deck with it. Audio recordings from traffic cams, those not deleted, captured the terror: metal buckling, cables thrashing, explosions of concrete breaking apart. At 5:46 a.m., the entire midspan dropped. Not gradually. Not in slow motion. It fell with terrifying speed, dragging cars, steel, and the bus downward in a violent plunge. Those who survived did so by sheer luck, positioning, angle, or being tossed onto fragments that remained afloat until rescuers arrived. Witnesses who regained consciousness in the water or near debris reported one last haunting detail: the silhouette. Still there. For a split second before vanishing into the fog. Some said he watched from the broken beam as the bridge collapsed, almost studying the result. Others believed he was caught in the collapse. But Reyes doubted that. If Harrow engineered the failure, he also engineered his escape. The forensic reconstruction ended with a startling conclusion: the Ravensford Bridge did not fall due to age, weather, or design flaws alone. It fell because someone exploited those flaws, with precision, preparation, and intent. It was a controlled failure disguised as structural fatigue. And the shadow in the fog wasn't a hallucination. He was the architect of the disaster. A surgeon of steel. A ghost with a purpose. A man who left no trace except the devastation behind him. Now Reyes had a timeline. A method. A suspect. But he still didn't have the most dangerous piece: the motive behind the collapse, and who ordered it. The threads finally converged: Harrow hadn't acted alone. A secret corporate faction had hired him to trigger a controlled failure and erase incriminating engineering evidence before an upcoming audit. Harrow executed the collapse with precision, then vanished. Reyes uncovered the final payment confirming everything, but exposing it would cost far more than silence.